Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm excited to share a new short story I wrote. It's called A for Abigail. And full disclosure, I just finished writing this story mere moments ago before I started recording. And it took me a little longer than I would have liked to have written it. For some reason, it takes me quite a while to write, even with just these short stories. I rarely write a story in one sitting. That's just how it is for me. It happens once in a while, but not as often as I'd like. It takes obviously significantly longer when I write things like scripts, TV scripts. But with this story, I figured let me at least plan it out, so I had a mini outline for it, so a general idea of certain scenes I wanted to write. But then what's always great is that as you write, sometimes things goes in a different direction. So I figured, okay, I'll see where this goes, and I came up with a different ending that I had originally had in mind. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Without further ado, for the first time in a while, and the first time this year, it's story time. The toy lay broken at her feet, a long, jagged piece of crooked yellow plastic that once belonged to the now disembodied caterpillar toy. For a moment, Abigail simply stared at it, this zigzag-looking piece of broken plastic. It was an innocent mistake. She hadn't thought it would break so easily just by pulling it a little too roughly. Would her mom be angry? Maybe she wouldn't be. After all, it was just a toy. She looked at her brother now, taking in his wide brown eyes and pouty lips and drool on his baby chin, not to mention his small, stubby fingers. There was no way their mom would ever believe he was the one who broke it. But it was worth a try. She scooped up the broken end of the toy and jammed the piece into her little brother's hand. His little fingers could hardly grasp the toy, and in fact, it clattered back to the ground the moment she let go. With a huff, she grabbed the other part of the toy, the dismembered caterpillar head, and forced it into his hands. His big round eyes stared at it for a second, as if in clueless wonder, before he brought it to his mouth and started chewing on it, the caterpillar's light green face growing darker with drool. "Abigail," came their mother's voice not too long after that, just as she knew it would. She appeared at the doorway, dressed for work in her pale blue nurse's scrubs. "What was that noise?" She pointed at her brother, who was still slobbering away on the caterpillar toy. "Brandon broke his brand new toy." Colette looked at the little boy in question, who let out a happy baby noise as the drool leaked onto the tray of his high chair. She walked up and wiped the side of his chubby cheek. "You don't know your own strength, do you?" she asked, not that he could answer. "I'm sure it was only an accident. What do you think?" Abigail nearly jumped when her mother looked at her. Colette had tired eyes, swollen and puffy with droopy bags under them, contracted from always working too late and sleeping too little. But they were also stern, yet warm, the windows into her smart, all-knowing nature. "I think he didn't mean to break it," Abigail said at last, her voice calm and steady, which surprised her. But then again, maybe it didn't. She was pretty good at lying. "You finished your homework?" Colette asked as she headed toward the door. "Yes, Mama," Abigail said. "All finished." "Good girl," Colette said. "You mind your father while I'm gone." Abigail never understood why her mom insisted on referring to her stepdad Damon as her father. He wasn't her real dad, but then he was as close to a real dad as she'd ever known, so maybe that was reason enough. "Always, Mama," she said. Colette paused at the doorway once more and turned back to her children. Abigail's heart sped up. She knew she was the one who broke it. Moms always know everything. "There's some leftover chicken soup in the fridge if you get hungry," was all she said. "Come give me a kiss goodnight." Abigail obediently dashed up to her mom and wrapped her arms around her in a hug, lifting her chin to receive the kiss Colette planted on her cheek. She gave a toothy grin, and with a soft grin back and a pat on her cheek, Colette was out the door, gone for the night. Abigail's deep brown eyes, just like her mother's, landed on Brandon. He'd apparently gotten bored with chewing on the caterpillar head and now resorted to slapping his sticky palms on his high chair tray in some loud, annoying rhythm that was downright grating on the ears. "You've got it lucky," she said with sheer, heated jealousy, the kind that pooled in the pit of your stomach and built up into venomous words you couldn't take back. But what did it matter? Her brother was just a clueless little baby. "You could get away with breaking every toy you owned if you wanted. Enjoy that while it lasts." He blinked. Yup, dumb all right. She breezed out of the living room just as Damon strolled in. "You going to bed?" he asked. "Yup," Abigail said without stopping. That was the extent of their interactions. A quick question, a curt reply. She liked it that way. "Ready for your bottle, little man?" she heard him ask, and she rolled her eyes as she turned the corner and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She shut the door and sat down in her desk chair. Her backpack lay on the ground, untouched since she dropped it there the moment she got home from school. She grabbed the forest green bag. She hated the color. She'd wanted this cool, glittery purple backpack, but her mom had said it was too expensive, and that this one was just fine, and she took out her books. Geography, math, vocabulary, science. A long night ahead of her indeed. Hours later, her hand cramped from writing. The words in her English textbook had started to blur, and her stomach rumbled. She scooped up the heavy book and lugged it downstairs. Damon was passed out on the couch in front of the TV, a blue glow in the otherwise darkened living room. She crept to the fridge and took out the chicken soup her mom had made, scooping some into a cup and placing it in the microwave. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the book. All she had to do was finish this last chapter and she'd be all caught up. She'd forgotten where she'd left off from, so she went for the middle of the page and started reading. The words hardly made any sense. She felt her head slump, and before the timer on the microwave had reached 0, the sleepiness gave way and she fell asleep right there at the kitchen table. Abigail sat in her desk, resting her cheek against her palm as she lazily scrawled the words her fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Eastman, wrote on the blackboard. Her eyes drooped a bit. It was too warm in here, too easy to doze off. "This will be on next week's test, so pay attention," Mrs. Eastman's pointed voice cut in, snapping Abigail awake. The chalk scratched against the chalkboard as Mrs. Eastman underlined a sentence with her defined hand. "If your quizzes were any indication, some of you really need to study harder." Why did Abigail get the feeling she was talking directly to her? The lunch bell rang, and she too eagerly slammed closed her spiral notebook and gathered her books, when Mrs. Eastman set down her chalk and picked up a stack of papers on her desk. Right then, Abigail froze, and a weird lurch in her stomach suddenly made her not as hungry for lunch. "Before you go, let me hand back your quizzes," Mrs. Eastman said, going down the row of students. "Don't forget, one of your parents has to sign it, whether you passed or failed." She was at Abigail's desk now, and wordlessly she slid the upside-down quiz paper onto her desk and continued on. Abigail almost didn't want to bother looking at the paper. Maybe she could pretend she'd misplaced it or something. And yet, as soon as she picked it up, she couldn't resist looking anyway. Her blood ran cold. There, the grade marked in red lay in front of her. 45, enveloped in a circle and a message beneath it. "Study harder, Abigail. You can do it." What did she know? Abigail thought darkly as her stomach hardened into a knot, permanently sealing away her hunger. Between English, math, social studies, and now science, it would be a miracle if she'd get even a D on her report card. She'd remembered studying for this particular quiz, or trying to study at least. Her brother had been wailing over who knew what. Seriously, what did babies have to be upset about? They didn't have any real problems. Even with her bedroom door shut, Abigail could hear her mom and stepdad arguing about feeding the baby. She'd turned on her radio and cranked up the volume so loud until her mom pounded on her door, telling her to turn it down because they were trying to put her little brother to bed. She'd finally given up on studying and gone to bed herself. And this is what she had to show for it. "How'd you do on the quiz?" her friend Faith asked at lunch, because of course she couldn't escape her failing grades even with her friends. "I bet I know how you did, Georgia. 100, as usual." Her tone was playful, yet there was an undercurrent of envy. Sure enough, Georgia gave a bashful smile and didn't answer as she bit into her sandwich. Of course Georgia got a perfect score. She studied harder than anyone Abigail knew, and it clearly paid off. "Well, I got an 80, Faith said. I forgot to study." "You never study," Georgia said. Now Faith was the one who smiled, though hers wasn't anywhere near as sheepish, but rather gleaming with pride. Faith was gifted too, but in a different way from Georgia. She was smart without even trying. It made Abigail wonder what it was about Faith exactly that she herself didn't have. Maybe school just came naturally to her. like she was born with some super genius gene. Or maybe she was a fast learner. Whatever it was, she managed a B- without so much as breaking a sweat. If Faith worked even half as hard as Georgia did, she'd be the smartest kid in class. But it seemed she was perfectly content with her grades. "What about you, Abby?" Faith asked. Abigail paused in her chewing as both of her friends now stared at her from across the lunch table. It was noisy in the cafeteria, yet, for a split second, silence rushed into her ears. She swallowed the bit of gooey mac and cheese she'd eaten. It was already getting cold, but still it was one of the better lunch options they served. 75, she said finally, and her eyes darted to her food as she stabbed at a piece of pasta and shoved it into her mouth. "That's not too bad," Faith said, clueless as ever. "At least you still passed." Abigail chewed her too cold pasta without another word, pretending for a moment it was the truth. But she could hardly grasp that glowing, prideful feeling of earning a passing grade. As good as she was at lying, she was terrible at lying to herself. "How was school, honey?" Colette asked when Abigail walked into the kitchen. Her hands tightened around the straps of her backpack as she thought of her quiz paper, tucked into one of her folders, needing to be signed. "Good," she said. "That's good," Colette said. Funny how her mom never asked any follow-up questions. If she'd said bad, she had no doubt her mom would ask why. What would she say then? "I'm failing in 4 subjects, and I just failed another quiz, and I'm definitely going to fail the semester, and who knows if I'll even pass 4th grade. It wasn't like her mom would be able to do anything about it. She worked all the time, and when she wasn't working, she was cooking or cleaning or paying bills or taking care of Brandon. Even now, she was cooking at the stove, since Damon would be home from work soon. They couldn't afford tutoring. She'd tried staying after school for extra studying sessions with other not-so-bright kids like her. There was this snobby girl, Hannah, and this dopey boy, Isaac, and all of them had been told the same cliché thing teachers always liked to say, that they needed to apply themselves more. But for Abigail, it was the same as sitting in class, trying to retain any information she could but still coming up short. "I'm going to go do my homework," Abigail announced. "Good girl," Colette said. Abigail headed up the stairs, and this time when she shut her bedroom door, she made sure to lock it behind her. Her heart started pounding as she withdrew her quiz paper, unfolded it, and uncapped a pen. She studied her hand, her brows tightening with focus and her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth. With a big swirling C and thin, scrunched-up letters for the rest of the name, always in cursive and slanting to the right, she signed her mother's name. She shoved the paper back into the folder and pulled out her math textbook so fast it flew out of her hand and landed on the floor like a stomping footstep. She hurriedly picked it up and flipped it open, though a few moments later she heard a knock on her door. "Abigail, what was that noise?" her mother asked. "Just dropped my book," Abigail said, telling her the truth for once. "All right, be careful. Don't want to wake your brother up from his nap, okay?" Colette said, and Abigail could hear the creak of the steps as her mom retreated down the stairs once more. She worked on her homework for the next hour, to the best of her ability, but it proved difficult. Math hardly made any sense. Social studies was boring, and English was confusing. Of course, there was also the big science test to study for, but she had a whole week. What was the point of starting now if she knew she wasn't even going to remember any of it? Even if she did start studying harder, she'd probably still get a crappy grade. "Keep lying to yourself, Abby," she thought scornfully. The week went by, and before she knew it, Abigail found herself the night before her science test, sitting with her head buried in her textbook and her eyebrows knitted together in concentration, as she read up on cells and organisms and mitochondria. What even was that? She'd heard the phone ring, but thought nothing of it. Her mom had left for work a short time ago, and as far as she knew, Damon wasn't even home yet. It was as she was trying to memorize the anatomy of a cell that a single knock on her door drew her from her studies. She looked up and waited for a moment, and when no sound came, she finally asked, "What?" "Could I come in?" Her throat felt dry all of a sudden. What did he want? She got up and unlocked the door, and she was already back in her desk chair when Damon opened the door and stepped inside. He slid his hands in his pockets and sort of shifted around on his feet, though he stayed near the door, like he didn't know whether to come in or stay where he was. The air grew thick with apprehension, for both of them, if his antsy behavior were any indication, though finally he said, "Your school called." She didn't flinch, an unwavering, detached expression glued on her face, but her stomach dropped. She knew where he was heading before he even said it. "They said you're on academic warning. Failing 4 classes," he said, as if this was supposed to be news to her. "I'll be fine," Abigail said. Yet another lie. "Don't tell Mom, okay?" It was almost painful to say those words, like she had to beg him. She didn't want to ask him for a favor, but what else was she supposed to do? "Don't you think your mom should know so she can help you?" "Mom can't help me," Abigail said, her voice almost shrill with how high it was getting. It surprised even her, and she reeled back and allowed herself to soften as she said, "She doesn't have time to help me. No one does." Damon took a step forward now. "I could help you." She must have looked doubtful in that moment, hesitant to believe him, let alone accept his help, which she was, because the next thing he said was, "If you'll let me." She wanted to ask what was the catch. Would he still tell her mom she was failing? Why was he suddenly being nice to her? Yet, as she gazed back at her science textbook, she knew she didn't have time to get into all that. The test was tomorrow. At the very least, she could always chalk her acceptance up to her sheer desperation. Without saying anything at all, she picked up her textbook and held it out to him. As Abigail sat in her desk at school the next day, watching as her teacher passed the tests out to each student one by one, Jessica, Kimberly, Liam, Maggie, a surprising yet welcome feeling of calmness washed over her. Mrs. Eastman reached her desk and handed her the test paper, and as she scanned it to see multiple choice questions, her eyes lit up. She knew these answers, well, some of them at least. "You may begin, class." She picked up her pen and found herself recalling what Damon had gone over with her the night before. They'd studied for hours, and toward the end, she'd found herself confessing that she was the one who'd broken Brandon's toy, and that he could tell Mama if he wanted to. He'd only grinned, not with malice, but with good-natured understanding. And he told her that it would be best for her to tell her mom. She'd later find out that her mom had known all along, because of course she did. Moms really did always know everything. But Colette wouldn't be angry about that. She would, however, be rightfully upset when she'd find out that Abigail had forged her signature, but relieved to know that she'd finally come clean about her failing grades. And her mom would offer to get her the help she needed, but Abigail would smile shyly and tell her that actually she wouldn't mind Damon helping her study when he could. And when she'd get this test back, even if it wasn't a high score, she knew she'd get there sooner rather than later, to the point where as she got older, she'd wind up with one of the highest averages in the class. Second only to Georgia, but she'd be okay with that. And then one day, as she approached the end of high school, she'd stumble across her brother, sitting at the kitchen table, struggling with his homework, and she'd remember when she was his age. She'd sit down next to him and ask, simply, kindly, "Need any help?" All right, that was A for Abigail. So with that ending, my first thought was, well, so she'll work hard and she'll get an A. But then my thought was, well, that sort of feels like a cop-out, because when you're struggling in any given subject, it doesn't happen overnight if you start studying hard. It takes time. So I figured over time, as she got the help she needed, tutoring one-on-one with her stepdad, that she'd improve at school. Because everyone learns differently. Some kids need that one-on-one attention. Some kids are just better in the group setting. It's different for everyone. So I figured with her also, part of her little character arc was that she had to stop lying. She was lying about her failing grades, even lying about silly things like breaking a toy. She had to come clean. With that clean conscience then she'd be able to improve in her schoolwork, because that's the whole point. She wants to get an A. She wants to do well, of course. And then I liked the idea where after she got older, she'd see her brother struggling and she'd offer to help him. So that was my mindset behind all that. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and on Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com, or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I'm going to be doing something different. I'm going to be discussing Pixar's 22 Rules of Storytelling. These are basically story writing tips by a former Pixar storyboard artist and director named Emma Coates. So that'll be interesting. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.